work on this 375 now. Sorry for the delay. It took a little longer to order pizza than what I planned on. We're gonna take apart this 375 and rebuild the check valves, and we're also gonna rebuild the relief valve on these. I don't know how many of these you guys actually work on out in the field. I know when I was testing, this is a relatively common unit in the 3 and 4 inch size. You see a lot of them used for containment. And good unit, not a lot of problems with them, other than one particular issue that we ran across with these pretty regular, and that is the low relief valve opening points on these. I don't know if has anyone ever had those kind of problems with these? You ever noticed low relief valve opening points on the 375? Okay, well, I have a theory on what causes that, and I want to show you that once we get to that point. But before we get to the relief valve, let's go ahead and let's rebuild the check valves in these. Now, the 375 is an inline check assembly, meaning that we have to remove the top access cover to get access to the check valves, and we access everything from the top of the unit. Now, the access cover on these is held together by a metallic coupling. So the first thing we have to do is remove our bolts from the metallic coupling. And then remove the coupling itself. Once we get the coupling removed, we remove the rubber gasket, and then that releases the access cover. Now the rubber metallic coupling around the outside is the only thing that seals this thing, that makes it watertight. Now, these check valves are held in here with snap-in plastic check retainers. Okay, basically, you'll see when I get it out, it's a round ring and it's got 2 thumb grips on it. Now, generally, you see these 2 thumb grips, you think you would just take and squeeze them together to pull the retainer out. That's not the easiest way to do that. The easiest way to get the retainers out is if you just grab one side of it and just kind of push it down until you get it out of that groove, and then just kind of work it around and it'll come right out of the groove. Then once you get it out of the groove, now you have to get it out of the backflow preventer, which is not always the easiest task. Now, generally, if you will take it and mash it together, then you can pull the retainer out. This is what they look like. Okay, now these retainers are check specific. If you look at this one, it actually says, right here, it actually says number 1 check valve only. So there's a number 1 check retainer and there's a number 2 check retainer. Now we'll pull your check retainers out. Now, in order to get these check valves out, you must pull the number 2 check valve out first before you can get the number 1 check out. So remove the number 2 check, you grab it by the spring assembly and you just rock it up and down, and then it will pop out of the machine surface, and then you can remove it from the backflow preventer. Okay, now, once you get the number 2 check out, now you can take your screwdriver, and there's a plate on the back of the number 1 check valve that looks like this. You can get your pry bar in that area right there, and you should be able to just pop the check out of the body of the assembly, just like that. Then you can remove your number 1 check. Now the checks they're the same check valve, they're the same size, so you can put these in backwards. And so make sure that you know the one that has the heavier spring on it is going to be your number 1 check valve. Now, the capture for your spring on the 375 check valve is you have a cap screw in the end of this, and then your spring rides against the crossbar on the guide bore in the cartridge of the check. That's your spring loading. Now again, with most of the larger diameter check valves, there's a way to safely access the disc area without having to disturb the spring retention. On the 375, you have a nut on the back of the disc holder that holds the disc holder in place. Now you can remove that nut without disturbing the loading on the check valve. You can remove the check, and you can remove the washer. Now you can remove the disc holder. Now when you remove this disc holder, note there is an O-ring right here that seals the disc holder to the screw. So make sure you don't lose that O-ring right there. or if you do lose it, make sure that you replace it when you put it back together. So if you miss this O-ring, it will leak through the stem, and your check valve is going to leak. So don't forget that there is an O-ring there. And once you get the disc holder removed, now, you'll say, where the fuck is the disc? The disc, now you can remove your disc, okay? And as usual, inspect your disc for any imperfections, any damage. Make sure you rinse it off good, clean it, and wipe it off. And inspect that. If there's any damage to it, or if the black's coming off on your fingers, make sure you replace that. And once you get it apart, you have your seat sealing surface that is part of the check cartridge right here. Always make sure that you inspect that disc area, make sure it's clean, free of chips, nicks, scratches. There's no damage to that seat area. Now that is one downside to the cartridge, non-metallic cartridge type checks, is because most of the seats are not replaceable. So if you get damage to the seat, you will have to replace the entire check valve. So now when you're working on a check valve, any type of a cartridge type check valve especially, always make special note of the condition of the seat O-ring, okay, that seals the check valve to the body of the unit. Okay, because what will happen over time, these things will lose their life. Okay, they'll get brittle, they'll get stiff, they'll actually conform to the shape that they're in inside that backflow preventer. So in other words, you got a square groove in your check valve, and then you slide this against a flat surface inside that check. So what will happen is that check valve will actually get four corners on it. It'll be square. If you pull a check valve out and an O-ring out and it's not nice and round in this orientation around this way, then that check valve has lost its life. It's lost all of its elasticity. It is degrading. It does need to be changed. So make sure that your O-rings are always nice and round, and that they still have some elasticity left to them, that they're not dried out and brittle. Okay, because what happens on these seat O-rings is, you know, when this thing is put in there initially, it's nice and fresh, and it's got plenty of life to it, and it's popped inside the backflow preventer, and it provides a good seal. Now, even though this thing dies, even though it loses its elasticity and it conforms to the shape, it'll still maintain its seal as long as it's not removed. But once you break that seal and you remove it, if it doesn't have any elasticity left to it, if it's shrunk, essentially, conformed to the shape, it'll never reseal again. So always make sure you pay particular attention to your seat O-rings on a cartridge type check. It's a very common failure that we find on these things. Okay, so we want to inspect our seat sealing surface, pay particular attention to our seat O-ring, make sure that everything is in good shape, make sure there's no cracking or any damage to the guide bore, or cross arms or anything in here that can cause failure to the check valve. So the spring is in good condition and everything is clean. And if it's small enough that you can actuate it, make sure that it will move freely. Okay, so everything appears to be in pretty good shape in this check, so we can just simply reinstall it. And just reinstall this by putting the disc back on the cartridge. Then we just put our disc holder back on here. Now again, do not forget this little O-ring right here. This little O-ring will cause you to have a leak because sometimes you pull these off and it comes out and you don't see it fall out. So, you know, we're not always working in a greatly lit location. Usually we're in some dark, dank mechanical room somewhere where you can't see anything. And so we want to make sure that we replace our O-ring. Then you can replace your retainer plate. And then you can replace your capture nut. So as you see, these check valves on these things are really pretty easy to rebuild. So we tighten these things down again, make sure that you get them nice and tight. Again, the manufacturers recommend that you put thread sealant on there, but I'm not a really fan of that personally, because again, I'm going to have to take this thing apart again at some point. But I want to make sure I get it on there tight enough that it's not going to vibrate loose on it. Okay? Because these things do experience vibration inside these units when they're flowing water. There is some degree of vibration created by the movement of the flowing water. So make sure you get it nice and tight. Okay, and then for the number one check, the repair procedure is exactly the same. And so then we're going to put this thing back together. So you have to put your number one check valve in first, or you won't be able to get to number 2 check in there because the guide stem sticks into the bore. So we got a larger diameter check, so we put that into the body of the unit first. Maybe. We took it out, right? Everything goes great until you need it to. So everything works until it don't. They are a little bit different size, by the way. The correct check valve at first. That always helps. Feel much easier when you put them in right. Oh, what do you do? Now, we got our check valves back in there. Now we put our retainer rings back in. Compress your retainer ring, put it back in there. And if you just reach in there and get one side of that started back in the groove, and then just kind of work it around, you should be able to hear it when it snaps in. And then when it gets in, you should be able to rotate it. It should be somewhat free in there. And then you'll have your retainer for the other side. I don't have the other check retainer because I broke it. So anyway, now that we've rebuilt our check valves. Okay, so we'll go ahead, I'm going to go ahead and put the top of it back together because I'm pretty confident that my repair is going to hold on my check valves. Replace your cover, put your metallic gasket back on it. And replace your metallic coupling. Gotta love it, right? There we go. Metallic coupling replaced, put your bolts back in. You want to make sure that you tighten this thing down nice and secure, because really it's just a compression fit. It just basically sucks that gasket around those 2 pieces of ductile iron to make the seal. So make sure that you use your metallic coupling nice and tight. And now we've rebuilt the check valve. Okay, so now we also need to rebuild the relief valve on this thing. So now these relief valves, it's an external relief valve with an external sensing tube. Now you can rebuild it on the unit, but I found that it's much easier to go ahead and remove the entire relief valve, and that way I can work on it on the bench. And so to remove the relief valve, you have two bolts, one on either side that hold it on, just a half inch bolt. Now these 2 bolts are the only support that this thing has, so you will have to support. But wait a minute before we do that. Before you remove that, you need to remove your sensing tube. Okay, it'll be much easier to get it off. Go ahead and remove your sensing tube from the relief valve first. Okay, now remove your relief valve from the body of the unit. Again, this is the only thing that holds it on, so you will have to support the full weight of the relief valve to remove the bolts. Okay, so we get our bolts removed now. Our relief valve is removed. I'm going to slide this thing over just a little bit so I'll run to work. Now, when you take this thing off, one thing to make sure that you note, lose your tools, is that there is an O-ring right here that seals this relief valve to the body of the unit. So make sure you don't lose that. A lot of times when you remove that relief valve, that O-ring will fall out. So make sure if it does fall out, you recover it, or that you have a new one. How to get access to this, you remove the bolts that hold the cover onto the back of the relief valve. Now this relief valve is spring loaded, okay, so you will have to maintain pressure on it while you remove the last couple of bolts. Bolts, now you can remove the relief valve cover. Now, generally when you remove the cover, the relief valve stem will come out with the cover. We'll come back to that in just a second. And you can remove your spring from the body of the unit. When you remove these springs, let me ask you this. Did you ever have to replace these springs? These springs are designed to last the lifetime of the backflow preventer. I mean, I know, you've probably been to classes, you had a manufacturer's rep stand up here and tell you, oh, if you got a low relief valve reading, or a low check reading, just stretch that spring, put it back in there, and it'll pass the test. And they're right, it will, one time. The spring still has memory, so if you stretch that spring, it will stretch for a little bit, but it's going to go back to its original condition. If you have a low reading, a low check reading, or a low relief valve opening point, chances are it's not going to be a spring problem. It's going to be a rubber problem. And so unless there's physical damage to the spring, it's bent, or it's broke, or these coils maybe are worn off due to cycling so many times, your springs are going to be fine. You do not need to change springs. Now, 375, your seat is just pressed into the body, so you should be able to just rock it over to the side, and that seat should come out. Okay, then you have a seat O-ring that seals this to the body of the unit. Remove that for inspection and cleaning. You have your seat. And then that's all there is to the body. So we'll set this aside now. And we will take our relief valve. Now the relief valve, you can just pull it out of the guide bore. Okay? You have your guide bore in the back of the unit. Always make sure that you clean this, okay, because this is actually a dry environment back here that's sealed with the rubber O-ring on the back of that stem. So if the O-ring fails, or if you have debris or scratching or build up inside this guide bore, you will have leakage out of that vent hole back there. Okay? So make sure you clean that out. Make sure your sensing passage is free and clear, that you can get flow through that. Now we turn our attention to the relief valve. Again, we have an O-ring on the back of the guide stem. It keeps the water out of the dry environment behind the relief valve. Take that off, clean it, and inspect it. Now, to disassemble the entire relief valve, you have one bolt that goes through the disc side of this thing that holds everything into place. So grasp it by the relief, by the guide bore stem. And then you can remove the bolt. Okay. And once you remove the bolt, remove your retainer plate, remove your disc. Now that the diaphragm holder will come apart in two pieces. Your inner diaphragm holder, and then you have your guide stem, and then you have your relief valve diaphragm. Now, this relief valve diaphragm is convoluted to somewhat in that it actually has creases in it. Anytime you have a diaphragm that has a crease in it, that's where you want to pay particular attention when you're doing your inspection on these relief valve discs or these relief valve diaphragms. Okay, because that's a wear point, because when this thing moves, it literally rolls that fold back and forth. Okay, so this is where your wear point is going to be. So you want to pay particular attention to this area here. You also want to pay particular attention to the bead area that fits inside the groove that seals it to the body. Okay, because if this is broken or cracked, you are going to have leakage to the diaphragm. Generally, when the bead is cracked, you'll actually have leakage outside of the body, leak through the body to house it. Okay, and then your guide stem, when you inspect it, make sure it's clean, make sure there's no cracking or damage to your guide stem. And then also the same thing on your diaphragm holder. Make sure that everything's in good shape. Again, as you can see, they've got that additional seat sealing surface inside the disc holder on this as well to prevent it from being pulled out. And that's all the parts that there are to this relief valve. It's pretty simple operation. And you just simply reinstall it, reassemble it in reverse order. Put your diaphragm back on your disc holder, and you put your guide stem back on top of that, and when you set the bolt in, it will compress that and put it back in the orientation that it needs to be. Okay, now we can replace our disc. Replace the disc holder, the disc retainer plate, and then put our cap bolt back in. Again, you want to make sure you get this tight. I would not over tighten this because again you're threading into plastic threads and you could break the housing by over tightening. So, but you want to get it tight enough that it's not going to vibrate loose. Okay, we need to replace our O-ring on the guide stem, and now the relief valve is completely rebuilt. It's ready to put back inside of that flow. Okay, now we turn our attention to our seat. We want to make sure that there's no damage to the seat sealing surface. There's no cracking or no breaking or anything in it. Everything is in good shape. We want to inspect our seat O-ring to make sure that it's good and clean and fresh. If you look at this one is actually worn out. Can you see those? You really can't hardly see them. This seat O-ring has actually got square corners on it, which tells me that this O-ring needs to be changed. But I don't have one right now, so we're going to say it's a new one. Put it back on the seat. Make sure we lube these O-rings up well. Now, you just press that seat back into the body of the unit. It just pops back inside there. Now, what actually holds it into place is when I put my spring back in there, it rests on the shoulders of that seat, and that spring pressure is what actually keeps the relief valve seat in place, and the O-ring provides a watertight seal. So we've got that done. Now, I'll talk to you about what I was talking about with the low relief valve opening points. This is my theory, because you find these things out in the field. Relief valve will open at 1.5, 1.7, 0.8, less than 2. It's a low relief valve opening point, so it needs some attention. So I take it apart, I look at everything, and everything looks just like this. It looks fine. I don't don't see absolutely nothing wrong with this that should cause it to be a low relief valve opening point. So I'll lube everything back up, put it back together, and it works fine. Come back the next year, exact same scenario. This is what I think happens. See, when we put this thing together, we lube this O-ring, right? This guide bore O-ring, and it slides inside this machine surface. This guide bore back here on the back side back here. The relief valve opens and closes. Okay, that makes sense, right? Okay. This vent hole on the back of this housing right here is open to atmosphere. It's a vent. It has to be there. Okay? Because if this vent becomes plugged, it will compromise the operation of the relief valve. Because if I plug that vent hole off, I can't pull that relief valve out of there. Because it actually creates a vacuum on the back side of it, and the relief valve will close. So, or the other way, if it gets plugged and it's closed, it creates an air pocket back there, and I physically cannot open that relief valve until I release the pressure off. So it has to be open to atmosphere. So when we rebuild this, we put lubricant in here. We lube it inside here, and we lube this. We put this in there, and it closes. Okay, meaning that O-ring slides to the front portion of this guide bore. Okay, this hole is open to atmosphere. So over the year's time, it gets atmospheric pressure inside there. So it also gets the same environment that the backflow preventer is installed in, right? So that means it gets humidity in there, it gets dry air in there, it gets smoke in there, if there's, whatever. But whatever air is the environment that it's around also gets inside this thing. In my opinion, I think what happens over time, just the air getting inside that guide bore dries that lubricant out. And it's not sticky anymore, or it's not slippery anymore, it actually gets somewhat sticky. And so when you take it apart, you clean it, you put fresh lube in there, now the relief valve is just happy as a clam. So that's my opinion. And I never did it, but actually I didn't think about it after I quit testing. But I've always thought that once you rebuild this thing and you put it back into service and the relief valve is closed, what if you just took just a little bit of lubricant on your finger and just dabbed it right across that vent hole back there? I mean, don't pack it full of grease like it was a greaser or something. But just a thin coat of lubricant over that vent screw to keep the air out of it, to keep the atmospheric pressure out of it. And I think that will take care of the low relief valve opening point. Because if you keep the air out of it, then the lubricant's not going to dry up. And that lubricant is such a thin layer that if it needed to open, it's going to push that out, and it's still going to open. So it's just something to consider, something to think about. And so if you're, if you run across that problem, and then I'm going to go ahead and reinstall my relief valve back into my relief valve housing. Put my spring back in. Now, one thing I did not mention, and I really should have, it's really kind of important on this unit. Before you take this cover off, always note the orientation of that sensing tube connection. Okay, because as you can see, the sensing tube on this thing is just a really short piece of pipe here. And this relief valve cover will go back on this unit in any orientation. But if you don't put it back in the same orientation that you took it off, the sensing tube will not fit. It will be too short, it won't reach. So you wind up having to take the cover off and completely rebuild the relief valve again to get it to hook back up. So now, but I did note that when I took it off, I noted, I just didn't tell you, that it was about 9 o'clock. It was at about 9:30 o'clock was the orientation that it needs to be at. So that way when I put it back together. Now when you put this housing back on here, kind of push it down by hand, and it should go just about all the way together. Okay, and what that tells me is that I do have my bead back in the groove. Because if you don't get the bead in the groove in that housing, when you tighten this thing down, you will collapse, you will crush that bead, and you'll cut it, and then you're going to have a leakage issue. So, but while maintaining pressure on the relief valve, put your bolts back in. I usually try to get a couple of opposing bolts in to kind of hold the spring tension, so I don't have to sit there and hold it while I put all the rest of the bolts in. Because one thing about this thing, just so you know, when you're putting that pressure on here, if you get one bolt in here, if you let this thing kick up, so it kind of kicks out of alignment, you can't force it back down. You have to take the bolt back out and realign everything to put it back together. If I was to find. There, now, that'll hold. Now I can go ahead and replace the rest of it. With any of these things, it's always a good idea to tighten your bolts in a crisscross pattern so that way you're sure that you pull everything down straight and flat. That one don't feel nothing. Don't fit, force it, right? Once we get everything put back together, now we're ready to reinstall our relief valve back on the unit. Okay, now I want to make sure that I get my O-ring back in my relief valve. You kind of have to be kind of careful with this one because it's not a really snug fit in there, it just kind of lays in there. So make sure that when you reinstall it on the bottom of the unit, it doesn't roll out on you. I'm going to put the back one in first, just because I can see it. Won't work real well that way, will it? There we go. Everybody won't see you yell at me this time. I've done this before, I promise. Actually, I did it just yesterday. Back on there. Close up. Reinstall our sensing tube. Which, you know, really, as long as you're at this point, you really should go ahead and take that sensing tube off and make sure that it's free and clear, that you can blow air through it both ways. Because you have to keep in mind that that sensing tube has to be able to move water in both directions. Because obviously it has to flow water into it to apply water pressure to the back of the diaphragm to close it. But it also has to flow water in reverse direction. When that relief valve opens, that water that's about the back of the diaphragm is not compressible, right? So when that relief valve opens, it's actually pushing that water back in the direction of the number one check valve in order for that relief valve to open. So make sure that that sensing tube will flow water in each direction. And then once you get your relief valve reinstalled, you get your sensing tube back into place. Now you're ready to pressurize the unit, do a test on it, and move on to your next assembly. See, these things, don't be intimidated by a large diameter backflow preventer. They're designed to be taken apart and worked on. And you know, we did that pretty much with no instructions required, right? Don't always work that way. I encourage you to look at the instructions before you start. Because a lot of times they will give you some helpful household hints in the instructions that will make it easier to take these things apart and put them back together. Okay? I admit I'm probably one of the world's worst about looking at instructions. If you give me something to put together with a set of instructions, I'm just going to start putting it together, and those instructions are supposed to say in case of emergency break glass. Because I'm not going to look at them until I have to. That's just the way I operate. I don't encourage you to operate that way. Okay? Read the instructions. A lot of times they will give you some helpful household hints. But there's nothing on these backflow preventers that we can't do out in the field. That's part of the criteria. They have to be inline repairable. And most all the time we can repair them. But that being said, there are situations when you get out in the field that you cannot make a repair to a backflow preventer. Okay, sometimes things happen to these things and they can't be fixed. And a good example, we had a situation over in Dubuque a few years ago when a bunch of small diameter watts, 009s, would not hold the check valve. Put brand new checks in it, rebuild them 3 or 4 times, and the check valves would just leak on them. It just could not repair them. So we sent them back to Watts for evaluation, and what the situation was, they were actually installed in a high pressure hot water application, which they were rated for that. It was less than 140 and it was less than 170 PSI, but it was still a hot water, high pressure application, and they were subjected to continuous water handling. And over time, what happened is it actually stretched the brass housing. When they took it back and evaluated it, the machine surfaces with a check seat had actually stretched out a little over 3 thousandths on each check valve. Well, that was enough that the O-rings just would not seal it. So in that case, the housings were inoperable, so they had to be replaced. So, because that was always one of my downfalls when I first started testing. It's like I work on a backflow preventer and I couldn't make it work, I couldn't fix it, I couldn't get it to work right, and it used to just confuse me and just frustrate me to no end. Because by God, this thing's supposed to be inline repairable. I'm supposed to be able to fix it, and I can't. Why? Well, sometimes the backflow preventers just get damaged. Sometimes they just cannot be fixed, and in those cases, they do have to be replaced. I've had some 909s that have had some chipping inside the machine surfaces, and there's nothing you can do about that. They have to be replaced. So, if you're out in the field and you can't get one fixed, don't think just because you say, fuck it, this thing got to be replaced. Don't think you're inadequate as a tester, because sometimes the backflow preventers themselves just cannot be replaced, not be repaired. Which brings me to one other thing I want to talk about before we move on. This is an epoxy coated device. Okay, the reason they put the epoxy coating on these is because it's ductile iron. The ductile iron is very susceptible to tuberculation, it's very susceptible to corrosion, because it's got a lot of iron in it. It's like galvanized pipe. What happens when you put galvanized pipe in a water system? It starts growing shit and flaking off and rusting. Well, if they didn't put a coating on these ductile iron backflow preventers, it would do the same thing. That's why it's there. Now, have any of you ever worked on an epoxy coated unit, and when you take it apart and you get inside of it, you find flaking, cracking, and chipping in that epoxy? Okay, when you find that, that backflow preventer needs to be replaced. Okay, it has reached the end of its useful life. Okay, because once that water gets underneath that epoxy and it starts flaking off, you're not going to stop it. Okay, when epoxy starts flaking off, where do those chips of epoxy go? They go into my relief valve and into my check valve. We actually had a 4H909 that was flaking so bad that enough of that epoxy chips had got past the wiper washer on the relief valve and built up in the relief valve stem in the bottom of that relief valve so deep that that relief valve literally could not close. It would go down about 2/3 of the way, and it would hold that relief valve a third of the way open. And when we took the plug out of it, we just got a handful of epoxy chips out of it. So the manufacturers say that this epoxy coatings on these things is designed to last about 10 to 15 years. So when you find that degradation in the epoxy on the inside of these things, you need to start talking to your customers about making arrangements to, at some point, change that thing out. Because it's not going to get any better, it's just going to get worse. So, just so you know. All right, 11:30, lunch is supposed to be here in about 15, 20 minutes. So, I think what I'm going